Our commitment to human rights and non-proliferation is illustrated by high-tech exports to major human rights violators who were involved in missile and nuclear proliferation, and human rights such as, for example, the right not to be burned to death in the factory that you're working where you're locked in. That consideration is zero. Warren Christopher, the Secretary of State, explained the matter of the congressional legislation which bans what they were doing by saying that by explaining to the Chinese that the administration would interpret the congressional legislation banning export of high technology, of high-tech equipment to China. They would interpret it as permitting such export, so that took care of that problem. Well, okay, that was the peak, the final peak of the achievements which illustrate the grand vision and gave rise to the praise and the swooning and the applause and so on and so forth. Now, intellectuals have a kind of a task at this point. They have to portray all of this as a triumph of our commitment to the free market and to human rights and to democracy. And intellectuals on the left, or on the left liberal side of the spectrum, also have a task. They have to portray it all as a demonstration of how what's called these days the politics of meaning guides every thought of the Clintons. And you want to make sure that you understand these instructions properly. Well, today happens to be Human Rights Day, so perhaps worthwhile mentioning that the Clinton administration at the very same time, in fact a few days ago, just illustrated its refined sensibility with regard to human rights. The Congress had passed legislation after considerable public pressure and lobbying and so on, passed legislation banning U.S. military training for Indonesian forces who are engaged in massive atrocities in East Timor. But the White House announced that it was going to provide military training to Indonesian military officers, and it explained that this was not in violation of the congressional legislation because the congressional legislation banned military training that the U.S. was paying for. But if Indonesia pays for the military training here, presumably using funds that we give them for that purpose, then that doesn't violate the congressional legislation. So that's the contribution to Human Rights Day, and it demonstrates the, as I say, refined sensibility of the administration in its human rights commitment, that part of the triad on which the vision is based. Also, at the same time, the White House announced that U.S. aid was going to close down 25 missions serving 31 of the poorest countries in the world as part of the cutback in what is in fact one of the most miserly foreign aid programs in the industrial world, which is now being reduced still further. That's, again, another contribution to human rights. You'll remember, since it's Human Rights Day, that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to which allegedly we're dedicated, about half of it is devoted to social and economic rights, the rights to decent health care, to food, to work, to union organizing, and so on. The U.S. has always rejected that part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and this little action a couple of days ago is another illustration of that. While rejecting the universality of the convention, we of course pontificate at great length about countries that don't meet our high standards and deny the universal validity of the convention. It's another thing to remember on Human Rights Day. As the Clinton administration announced its agreement with China to provide high technology weapons, they stated that there was no linkage established between the high technology sales and human rights issues. Well, that doesn't come as much of a surprise either. As you know, the Clinton administration is drawn to a substantial extent from officials of the Carter administration. The Carter administration opened its crusade for human rights right after it came into office in 1977 by facing one of the toughest problems. At that time, the United States was providing an enormous amount of armaments to the Shah of Iran, who ranked quite high, maybe on top, among human rights violators, maybe had the record or came close to the record in torture of political prisoners and many other atrocities. And that posed a certain dilemma for the human rights crusade, and they faced it quite squarely. In April 1977, Secretary of State Cyrus Vance went to Iran and put pressure on the Iranians, namely to accept new, sophisticated, high-technology military equipment, which Iran had not requested and probably couldn't even use, and which apparently was going to be managed and run by U.S. military forces. He was asked by reporters how this comported with the human rights crusade, and stated that there was no linkage raised between human rights issues in Iran and the sale of high-technology weapons, which were necessary for the benefit of U.S. corporations. And so it proceeds. A recent example was George Bush and James Baker. As the Berlin Wall was tottering and falling, giving a final end, symbolic end of the Cold War, Bush and Baker were in internal deliberations since LEAP, pressing for $1 billion of new loans to their friend Saddam Hussein over the objections of the Treasury and Commerce Department. The objections didn't have anything to do with gassing Kurds or torturing dissidents or anything marginal like that, but with the fact that Iraq simply didn't appear to be creditworthy. But Bush and Baker overrode those objections and insisted that they get the loans because of the great commercial opportunities that Iraq was offering to American corporations, and because they were contributing to the stability of the Middle East. Stability is one of those code words, which means they're doing pretty much what we tell them to do. And that commitment to their great friend and ally continued up until the day when Saddam Hussein demonstrated that he wasn't contributing to stability, that is, he wasn't following orders, at which point he made the usual transition from favored friend to reincarnation of Attila the Hun. So that's another example of our vision of human rights. And in fact, it's kind of intriguing to watch over the years, Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, to see what changes as one vision replaces another. I leave it to those of you with sufficiently refined sensibility to see if you can detect what changes. Well, that was the apogee. That was the peak of the grand achievements, the Seattle Summit. Let's go back to the one that immediately preceded it. The one that immediately preceded it was the passage of NAFTA, the executive version of NAFTA, in mid-November. What was going on right at that period, right before the House vote and right after it, is extremely interesting and revealing. There was a kind of crescendo of hysteria building up among political leaders and in the press, which is a little bit unusual. Usually the political leaders and the press commentators try to repress their class loyalties. They don't want them to be too much on the surface. They try to take a pose of being above the fray. But this time that didn't happen. It all came out in the open. Actually, the New York Times even used the phrase class lines. I don't think I've ever seen that before in the press. It's one of the things we're not supposed to say. Too much was at stake, and it was impossible to keep it quiet. In the days before the vote, days immediately before the vote, you recall that Clinton was speaking publicly about, and quote his words, the real roughshod, muscle-bound tactics of organized labor, the raw muscle, the sort of naked pressure that the labor forces have put on, involving pleading based on friendship and threatening based on money and work in the campaign when they approach their elected representatives. You obviously never see a corporate lobbyist sinking that low. There were front-page stories which featured the president's call to Congress to resist the hardball politics of the powerful labor interests. Business was reeling from the onslaught, you know, to barely face the terror of the mob. Anthony Lewis wrote at the far left, you know, wrote an article in which he denounced the labor movement as backward and unenlightened. The crude, threatening tactics used by unions to make Democratic members of the House vote against NAFTA underline that point. Labor was driven by fear of change and fear of foreigners, really dangerous people. The Times had an editorial the day right before the vote, listing that little box in the editorial, listing the representatives from the New York area who had announced they were going to vote against NAFTA, and next to every one of them, they listed the amount of the contributions they had received from labor in their last political campaign, and the Times pointed out that that's rather ominous. It's an unsettling pattern. It indicates that maybe these people aren't voting their consciences, but are just being threatened by the crude, threatening tactics and the raw muscle of labor. Well, as a number of the aggrieved representatives later pointed out, the Times had not listed corporate contributions to representatives, nor for that matter had it listed attitudes of Times advertisers towards NAFTA, and asked whether that suggests an unsettling pattern about their enthusiastic support for it. But to criticize the press for this is a little bit unfair for several reasons. For one thing, it's kind of unnecessary to point out, to discuss corporate contributions. That's like reporting on the fact that you breathe air when you walk around. I mean, if that's the way the country's supposed to run, it's supposed to be run by powerful business interests. That's taken for granted. So it's no threat to functioning democracy if corporate lobbyists twist people's arms and pour huge amounts of money into the campaign and so on. That's just the way it's supposed to work. It's when labor tries to get involved. It's when working people try to become involved in influencing legislation that there's a real threat to democracy, and you have to get hysterical about it. Furthermore, it's, again, unfair to criticize the Times for not pointing this out, because they did indeed have a front-page story comparing labor lobbying with corporate lobbying, in which the reporter Michael Wines accurately pointed out that there was just no comparison. I mean, corporate lobbyists were in, fancy suites right next to the House floor with all kind of, fancy telephones and appurtenances and celebrities all over the place. Labor, they said you could find, a couple of blocks down the road in a boiler room somewhere without any telephones and, so on. They quoted one corporate lobbyist who was in the Carter administration and was looking at this and saying it's going to be a complete blowout. There's no worry about it. So they did tell the story accurately. There was a slight problem. The story was published the day after the vote. But again, it's unfair to criticize them for that. The newsroom is a busy place, and things sometimes fall between the cracks, and so on. But what's interesting about the hysteria, and it was real hysteria, I mean, the examples that I cited are illustrative, is that it illustrates that the traditional hatred for democracy among privileged elites, which is, after all, not very surprising because democracy would threaten privilege, that this is not just hatred of democracy, but it's passionate hatred of democracy. If the mob, the rabble, ever begins to become involved in something like requesting that their representatives do something, the civilization is coming to an end. It's not just a small problem from the point of view of a spectrum of opinion running from, say, Anthony Lewis over to the right, but it's a major problem. In fact, it's a catastrophe. That reflects hatred of democracy, which is true passion. And again, it won't surprise anyone who's familiar with intellectual history. If you go back to the 17th century, first modern democratic revolutions in the 17th century in England, and you look at the way, the privileged classes and the educated were responding to efforts of the rabble to become involved in the political process, the hysteria was very similar. In fact, nothing has changed since those days. except that now it's rarely necessary to rise to these heights because usually the